It's almost biblical. They really despise Trump. I think that's genuine, but they act like him.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Monday, August 25th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and joining me are Real Clear Politics President and co-founder Tom Bevan and Washington Bureau Chief Carl Cannon. So, Tom, your hometown is in the news. The Washington Post reported over the weekend that the Pentagon has drafted a plan that could potentially send at least 3,000 National Guard troops to Chicago as early as next month. Mayor Brandon Johnson and Governor Pritzker have vocally opposed any such deployment. So what's going on, and what are the chances that Chicago is Trump's next takeover target?
Well, it seems like the odds are likely, given the signals that Donald Trump himself is sending. And look, Chicago's a very similar situation to Washington, D.C. The homicide rate is down from highs that were a couple of years ago, but still, 256 people, according to Chicago Police Department. There are other independent groups that have that number higher, but have been killed so far. So basically a person every day, and a person is shot in Chicago once every 4 hours. And so, the question is, well, why is that tolerable? Why wouldn't we be doing something more to stop that? And remember, the violence in Chicago is really concentrated in a couple of neighborhoods on the west side and the south side, so plenty of people in Chicago live in neighborhoods where they feel safe. But if you don't live in one of those, if you live in one of the neighborhoods that's still pretty violent, I think they would welcome having some more resources to help fight crime in those areas.
But Carl, is that what this is really about? Because when you look at what they've done in Washington, it seems like it's more of an immigration enforcement mechanism than anything else. And you had Tom Holman, the border czar, saying over the weekend that Chicago was a possibility for National Guard. But he also talked about a separate plan to have the National Guard help ICE in 19 states. So how much of this is about the kind of crime that Tom is talking about, and how much of it is about this move to sort of amp up the ICE enforcement?
Well, Democrats would tell you it's all grandstanding, and that the crime's going down. I'm skeptical of it, but that Trump doesn't care about that issue anyway, that he's just trying to make the Democrats look bad. That's what they'd say. Your question, Andy, is the more nuanced one. Is this really about a broader issue? These states and cities have declared themselves sanctuary cities, sanctuary states. What they meant by that was their police departments would not cooperate with ICE, even in cases, not to enforce run-of-the-mill immigration law, but even in cases where immigrants, illegal immigrants, were charged with very serious crimes, and even in some cases convicted of crimes. They just wouldn't participate with the federal government. And this is an issue that, if you look at it, take a step back on a broader way, this was settled by the Civil War. The federal government has primacy, and until Donald Trump came on the scene, liberals had a long history of supporting federal intervention, to support civil rights law, to protect the rights of minorities. And what conservatives are saying on social media is, look, this is the same thing. This is the people being killed by these gangs in these cities. They're almost all black. In Washington, D.C., there was a demonstration of people chanting Black Lives Matter. And, some people who support what the administration is doing say, well, that's ironic, because the lives that Trump, if this works, the lives that they would save mostly are black or African American. But my own question is this really what the federal government's supposed to do? I was so shocked to find myself in agreement with Brandon Johnson. I never thought that day would come. But he said, that's why when people join the military, is to occupy the streets of America. He's right about that.
Well, Tom, what about this, though? I mean, what about the immigration angle on this?
Well, it's certainly true that the Trump administration has going after these cities and states that have declared themselves, sanctuaries. And as Carl said, don't participate, work with ICE at all. And Brandon Johnson has been very explicit about that. J.B. Pritzker just signed a bill Friday before last, giving financial aid, student financial aid to people who are illegally. So they're very much leaning in to the sanctuary aspect of this. So there's no question that that's part of it. But there hasn't been a murder in DC in 11 days, I think it is. And as I said, someone's getting murdered in Chicago once every 20 hours. Why would we not want to prevent that from happening? Think of how many lives would be saved. Chicago has been run by Democrats for 95 years. And even at the height when there were over 500, 600 people being murdered every single year, nothing was done about it. I mean, I would wake up and read the Chicago papers every single morning. 2, 3, 4 people died, and you become numb to it, and it just becomes accepted. And I never understood why there wasn't the political will by Barack Obama or anybody else to say, we're not going to stand for this and send in the National Guard. But Democrats never did that.
All right. Well, Carl, I want to talk about another city.
Closer to home, yeah.
Yeah, a little closer to home for me, but also happens to have another Democratic governor who might be running for president in 2028. That might be one of the things that ties Chicago and Baltimore together. But Governor Westmore and Donald Trump are at it. They both sniping at each other, talking about each other's military experience or lack thereof. And Trump really took this to the streets. He says that he might consider cutting the federal funding for rebuilding the Key Bridge, which collapsed back in March of 2024. And that's something that locals really know about and care about. But what do you make of the fight between Westmore and Donald Trump?
Well, what's interesting is how quickly it got out of hand, because Westmore prides himself on being a person who can disagree civilly with people. He's a very liberal guy. But he when I saw him at the Hoover Institution, met him there. He talks to Republicans. He doesn't seem to break out into hives whenever he mentions Trump's name, at least until now. And he sent the president a letter and said, before you say our city's this hellhole, why don't you come on a walking tour? And Westmore seemed to think he was being conciliatory or making a gesture or it's not how Trump took it. He said it was nasty in tone. He got mad. He said, clean up your mess before I walk there. and then Trump tweeted something about, some stolen valor accusation because Westmore was awarded the Bronze Star, but the paper took like 17 years. It was a kind of a curious case, to be honest with you, but I never heard anybody, he served honorably and admirably. And then that set Westmore off. Then he was triggered, and he called him. What did he call him? President Bone Spurs.
Bone Spurs. Because
yeah. So
Vietnam War because
but Bone Spurs that were apparently non-existent. But so yeah. So this relationship, I'm pronouncing this. These two men have now been officially divorced.
Well, it was never much of a marriage of anything. It was a marriage of convenience, if there was any marriage at all. But Tom, what do you make of it? Because, like I say, Westmore is on people's list as someone who might be a good candidate.
And that's the real intrigue here. Is I'm sure Westmore saw Gavin Newsom and the amount of attention and praise and adulation that he's gotten from Democrats for being, the guy who's standing up to fight with Trump, and he's trolling him with these tweets in all caps. And Westmore, I think, decided that he wanted in on the action, because there's no way to raise your profile faster in the Democratic Party than to be seen as, getting after Trump. And so he's eagerly, I think, mixing it up. No one's twisting his arm to do any of this stuff. And because I think he does have aspirations for 2028. But notice, where's the mayor of Baltimore? We're talking about mayor of Chicago. Why are we talking about the governor of Maryland, not the mayor?
Well, first of all, just a little course correction. I mean, Trump was the guy who mentioned Baltimore as well as Chicago and Oakland as right. I mean, those were sort of the cities that he named. So he pulled out, but he could have talked about Boston. He could have talked about any number, and people have pointed out there are a number of red state cities that he could have talked about as well. So I buy your point that no one loses in the Democratic Party for standing up to Trump, but Trump kind of picked this fight, I think, a little bit himself. And I do, he did say he would take Trump on that walking tour on a golf cart, which was pretty good.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Good
So
high
no,
trolling,
if your bone spurs are hurting you,
Yes,
Beck, we
right.
could probably arrange a golf cart.
That's quality trolling, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway. Hey guys, we're gonna take a quick break. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Carl and Tom. We'll be back with more right after these words. Carl, the Democratic National Committee started its annual summer meeting today in Minneapolis. DNC Chair Kevin Martin said, quote, "There is no doubt we have work to do. The party's popularity is historically low. Fundraising is down. Party registration is down." Carl, is there any good news for the Democrats as they start this week's meeting?
Well, Ken Martin, got the meeting in his hometown, so that's the good news. The bad news is now what does he do? You're right. The fundraising's down. We talked last week about how young men are not joining the Democratic Party, so party registration is down, as you mentioned, and there's no real party leader, which is what we were talking about a minute ago. This jockeying between people like J.B. Pritzker and Gavin Newsom and Wes Moore. It underscores they don't know who their nominee is, and they don't really know who their leader in Congress is. I mean, nominally Hakeem Jeffries is, and Chuck Schumer are the leadership, but neither control their House and their body. So it's everything's up in the air for the Democrats. They keep talking about process, though. Have you noticed this? And attacking Trump. How much do we attack Trump? Um, you know, Tom mentioned is Gavin Newsom trolling Trump. But people are trolling Gavin Newsom for how much when he does the all caps thing, Andy, he's imitating Trump. And Babylon B had a meme where they had Gavin Newsom with his ear bloodied and said, Gavin Newsom pays someone to shoot him in the ear to be more like Trump. And this, I think, underscores the fundamental issue for the Democrats. It's almost biblical. They really despise Trump. I think that's genuine, but they act like him. And that doesn't seem, they seem to have created a trap for themselves. And so, when they're meeting in Minneapolis, they're going to talk about, fundraising and this and that and the other. They're also going to talk about the primary schedule, which gave them problems last time. That's the big issue to fix. But the other thing they fix is who do they want to be as a party and how do they want to behave? And, Trump has really sort of messed with their heads. And this is the first step to try and get themselves on track.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Tom, there is a little bit of good news. They're leading in Virginia, right? In polls, the New Jersey, of course. They've got Roy Cooper and Sherrod Brown. So that's North Carolina and Ohio. They've got good Senate candidates. There's got to be some good news going into this. Anything else that you can think of?
Well, they did get the candidates they wanted, and they've recruited some good candidates, despite the fact the party seems to be sort of in the toilet. I mean, the other piece of this equation are the Republicans. And I mean, Donald Trump has, the Epstein files, I think, has been a drag for him a little bit. But just in the last week, he's done two things. We talked about taking a stake in Intel, 10% stake in Intel, which is sort of, I think, got some people in the conservative movement a little, wary about that and trying to defend that position. And then today he signed an executive order making it a crime to burn the American flag, which the reaction I saw on Twitter was, even among conservatives, was like, well, this isn't constitutional. Why would you be doing this? To the extent Trump continues to do things that, peel away a few of his supporters here and there on these various issues, it's going to make it more difficult for Republicans and easier for Democrats next year to, perhaps win the House back, but to get themselves sort of back in the game. That's if they can stay out of their own way and not, keep pushing hard on all of these trans issues and illegal immigration, as we mentioned. I mean, they just seem to be hardwired to do that, despite the fact that I think most observers think that is not good for them electorally.
Yeah. Carl, you mentioned the primary schedule, which is actually interesting. That's not officially on the agenda, but all the reporting is that's what's talking. That's what everyone's focused on. And later this week we should do a deeper dive on this. But this primary calendar is a concern. What's at stake here?
Andy, Martin said he'd like to get this settled. But it's not an easy thing to settle. New Hampshire was first for many years. Then Iowa jumped in front with their caucuses. Turns out Iowa couldn't count the votes in either party. And so Iowa kind of got put on the curb. But New Hampshire went first last time. Joe Biden lost. He lost in Iowa too, and he lost handily. And in the old days, that would have been it. But he'd moved to South Carolina up. He'd elevated it, and South Carolina had disproportionate power. And before the complaint was, well, New Hampshire's too white. Then the question hinges, was South Carolina not white enough? You're talking about a Democratic primary election. Nobody wants to talk about these things openly. I don't. I'm not going to mention it again all year, but the question is, which state should go first and why? And how should the calendar follow after that? And why is it so early? Why is it so front loaded? They created problems for themselves, and both parties have done this. That's because they let the states kind of dictate. I don't know that there's an easy answer to this, but Joe Biden knew what he was doing, making South Carolina first. And it's one of the reasons he didn't have any kind of challenge, even after he'd shown some signs of immunization.
And see how that worked out for them.
Yeah. So I don't know what's going to happen there, but this is something that people who care in the DNC who really want the party to do well said, you've got candidates now who are going to adjust their schedules, their fundraising, their decision whether or not to run based in part on this calendar, and we've got to get it sorted out. And already these candidates are splitting their time between South Carolina and New Hampshire because they don't know which one goes first. So that's something we should watch.
Yeah, Tom, that's the thing which I find so interesting about it is that if you're trying to plan a national campaign as a Democrat now, it really does matter where you spend your time, where you get your money, where you get your endorsements, depending upon which state goes first, which state goes second, which is early, which is late. I mean, it's pretty fundamental to winning the nomination next time around.
It is, and for the 25 years we've been doing this, I mean, it was always the battle between Iowa and New Hampshire. And the New Hampshire Secretary of State was considered a deity almost, be protecting the status of New Hampshire's first primary in the nation. And we sort of settled into this, I was the first caucus, New Hampshire was the first primary, and that everybody else, remember Florida tried to jump up and then they were penalized and they tried to strip their delegates. And it's been fascinating to watch, but I suspect the Democrats will go back to getting New Hampshire and Iowa perhaps in the mix, certainly New Hampshire. It's amazing to me how quickly and easily they managed to supplant both of those states with South Carolina just to protect Joe Biden.
Yeah.
And he's no longer, because remember, I mean, this was like a blood feud for they talked about lawsuits and all sorts of things. And then suddenly it was like, okay, well, sure, South Carolina can go first. I think that's going to change.
Yeah. Hey, Carl, I do want to talk about this tweet or post or whatever that Trump put out on Sunday night. He attacked ABC, NBC News, saying he's in favor of the FCC revoking their licenses due to their negative coverage of him, or at least their license fees should go up. He points to this Media Research Center study that claims that 97% of the coverage of Trump in the first 100 days by the networks was negative. And he said, crooked journalism should not be rewarded. It should be terminated. So how serious should we take this? He's threatened this kind of stuff before.
Well, I think that, yeah, and he said 97. I think the study you referred to said 92, but that's 92%, but that's probably quibbling. Look, the networks have become, anti-Trump and pro-Democrat. This has happened over the course of a generation. It's unhealthy. Tom Bevan talks about it pretty much every week on our show.
I know we got to leave time for a media rant here. So
I'm not. I'm going to try and stall and help Tom not He doesn't have to do it. Doesn't feel obliged.
You gotta save me from myself.
But this is obviously not, in my opinion, what Trump should be doing. When he ran for president, the Democrats said all this crazy stuff about him. He's an authoritarian. He's a Nazi. He's to the right of Attila the Hun. He'll take all your freedoms away. And I got tired of that talk, and so did most swing voters, so did most independent voters. It was seemed excessive and overheated and unfair. But I have to say, since Trump's been president the second term, he's done everything he could to try and validate that criticism. He's taken over the Kennedy Center. He's taken over this, that, and the other thing. He's going to blow up the East Wing of the White House, which is, he just does this flag burning thing you mentioned. This is a case directly adjudicated in recent times by the Supreme Court. He's just, there are no guardrails. There's nothing he doesn't want to get involved in. And this is an example of something he should just resist his impulse to try and take it over. And he should do what Tom does. He should just complain about
it. Tom,
maybe Donald Trump could host his own media rant. Well, he kind of does on Truth Social. So, I mean, not much different.
Well, Tom, how seriously should we take this?
I don't think you can take it too seriously. I mean, how would this actually happen? I think this is Trump just venting. And listen, he does have a K that these news organizations are relentless in their negative coverage of him. I mean, that is a fact. And, does that bother him? Of course. And does he want that to change? Yes. Would he prefer that they give him some positive coverage? Sure. But that's not the world that we live in. In many ways, he benefits from all the negative coverage in terms of like galvanizing his base. I mean, even people, you remember the first time, even people who were kind of squishy on Trump were like, yeah, the media really does treat him terribly. Everybody knows that. So this is not something that's going to go anywhere, I don't think. And if it did, I think it would be a huge overreach on his part.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Anyway, you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Carl Cannon and Tom Bevan. Don't go away. We'll be back with more right after these words.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics. I'm joined now by Andy Rotherham, who's a friend of the company. He helped start Real Clear Education for us. He's a longtime education expert, worked in the Clinton White House, and served as a school board member in the Virginia State School Board for both Republican and Democratic governors. Thanks for joining us, Andy.
Hey, Carl. Thanks for having me.
We've got another gubernatorial race in Virginia, and it gets more attention than it probably should, since governors in our state could only serve one term. But like New Jersey, it's an off-year election, so everybody wants to know the way the wind is blowing. The wind is blowing in the Democrats' way, presumably, because that's what happens in Virginia. We see ourselves as kind of the corrective. Abigail Spanberger is leading in the gubernatorial race, but it seems that the Democrats are trying to, sort of try to help the Republicans, like they did 4 years ago. And weirdly, there was another incident in Loudon County involving transgender. The details are murky. The Loudon authorities never really tell the truth about what's happened, but some of the reports you saw was that a trans kid went into a boy's bathroom and maybe was using the phone to film them. The boys complained about it, and the trans kid didn't get suspended. The boys got suspended. That's the story. We don't really, the media isn't really covering it. We learned this from conservative social media. But all this is eerily like what happened 4 years ago, Andy. And I guess let's start with this. Why are Loudoun County school officials trying to sabotage Democratic candidates?
Well, yeah, it is always Loudon, it seems like, and people sort of roll their eyes when there's another. It's like the Florida man thing. It's Loudon schools again and again. So a couple of things. You had a lot there in that question. A couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, in the school officials' defense, this all involves minor students, and so they are actually, people always want like all the details and are like, you're not telling everything. And Loudon has historically had some issues with being transparent about a number of things, including some problems with overdoses. On the other hand, schools cannot be as transparent as people want because you're talking about kids. So there's details in this case that are simply not going to be made public, and that's actually appropriate again because we're talking about minors. But yeah, what seems to have happened is it involved a locker room. A student was in the locker room. She was I'm going to get the details, but it was a transgender student was in a locker room that didn't correspond with their biologic sex. And so some boys they objected and so forth. And of course now like everyone and parents are involved. And the school did bring an investigation against the boys and suspended them, which again, the details, we need to wait till we hear more details about everything that happened, but it's certainly not a good look, and it touched this sort of flashpoint that we're having with this. The case, though, that I would keep my
Well,
eye
wait a
on.
minute. Wait,
Sure, sure.
before we leave this. So once again, 4 years ago, there was a case of a kid who was identifying as trans who was accused of sexual assault. The Loudoun County people, again, they didn't do anything about the kid. They lashed out at the parents of the kids of the victim, the father of the victim, and this became an issue that helped um, Governor Youngkin get elected. And so once again, so Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl Sears is saying, okay, they're at it again. She's immediately taking the conservative side, the side of the socially conservative parents. Again, nobody even knows all the facts, including the Lieutenant Governor, but she and Abigail Spanberger didn't say anything. And so once again, this crops up. Then we have that you can't make this stuff up. I initially thought this was an AI joke that conservatives had done to make Democrats look bad, but the woman in Arlington, the Democratic activist who held up the sign, basically saying, if trans men can't use girls' bathrooms, Winsome Sears, you can't drink at integrated drinking fountains. She's a black immigrant kind of person that Democrats, liberals usually celebrate, but she's a conservative. And some wise person on Twitter, you alerted to me, some clever person said, I don't, words to the effect of, I don't think that's going to be our talking point as Democrats. If you don't let transgender people use bathrooms, we're going to join the Klan.
Yeah, well, it
That's
was different. What's different this time? You saw that, and look, I mean, this is the problem in any election. You get local activists on both sides, and this is like a local activist group that a longtime Arlington school board member, and Winsome Sears was at the Arlington School Board. This a former school board member has this sort of activist group, and the thing you saw that was different this time is Democrats have learned there was almost immediate denunciation because it is a weird thing to say, look, if you don't agree with my positions on transgender issues, I'm going to sort of become a follower of Bull Connor. That is a strange position for Democrats to take. And everybody was outraged, both by the content of it and then also the timing of it. And what you didn't see is, as opposed to 2021, there wasn't a lot of testing the waters of where the activists were and so forth. Spanberger denounced it immediately. In fact, it was on one of these weird things on social media. All these conservative Twitter accounts, X accounts were demanding that she denounce it, and she'd already denounced it like hours ago. It moved that quickly. And that shows you this is not necessarily 2021. The case I do want to call your attention to, though, on the Loudon parallels. Well, two things on Loudon. One, it wasn't just that issue with the father whose daughter had been and the issues around and there's a place where the school district wasn't transparent with about a student who was it turned out repeat offender in terms of sexual assault. There was also, they were capping access to advanced math classes. That's what really set a lot of people in the county off, particularly a lot of non-white parents who had moved to the county for the quality of education that Loudon offers. And suddenly they were saying because of equity, they couldn't offer these advanced classes anymore. You couldn't take them. So there was a bunch of things going on there. The best reporting on it, actually, of all places, was Matt Taibbi, who, I was never, when he was like, wanting to hang every banker in sight, I was never a huge fan, but he came in and just did some really good reporting, actually went to Loudon and reported, and it was sort of better reporting than you got out of the local papers around here on, and anyone was really interested in that backstory, I'd recommend his work.
the Washington Post really, for odd reasons, refused to cover the story, and Matt Taibbi actually filled a vacuum. Um,
Absolutely.
uh,
They didn't cover it to the point where they didn't cover it until there was actual indictments. And I think the average reader was like, wait, what? Like people were being indicted and there was there'd been no sort of context that this was going on. And the whole story was nationalized with his father who got arrested at the school board meeting with little context of what he was actually there. he wasn't there to protest CRT or whatever. He was there because like he wanted some transparency about the situation with his daughter, which really was a ghastly situation in terms of how it was handled. Which also again shows 2021, the student in question wasn't even the perpetrator wasn't even a transgender student, but because of the perception that they might be, the school district handled it in a very peculiar way. It was a bad case.
Andy, let's I cut you off. You wanted to pivot to Fairfax and another issue that relates to the Virginia race, and then and we can look at this with a broader lens because it's an interesting race between two interesting candidates, and Virginia is going to get its first female governor regardless.
Absolutely. It's high time for that, and we will, whichever way it goes. We can talk about the race. Just the case, again, the details are murky. We don't know a lot yet. But the case to me that feels more like the Loudon situation in 2021 is there's a Fairfax case where there's allegations that school personnel facilitated and paid for an abortion, at least one, for a minor student. This has that 2021 feel because again, it's not hasn't really broken into mainstream media that much. There's an investigation. There's allegedly a whistleblower and a paper trail. Again, I say allegedly because the facts are all very murky, but apparently there's a teacher who at the time raised objections about this. Whether or not that is true, I can't say. Again, this is all, but there's some early sort of reporting on starting to happen, but it hasn't really broken through yet. That's the case I would watch. If it turns out to be a big nothing, I think that will be a problem for the Republicans because you'll start to have a boy who cried wolf phenomena here. If it turns out to be something, it can be the kind of issue that underscores some of the concerns. And look, they need an issue. The race is Abigail Spanberger, who is a former Democratic congresswoman, very moderate. She's enjoyed a steady lead, depending which poll you believe, large or decent sized lead the entire campaign. And she's leading in fundraising. She's a much higher quality candidate overall, much more disciplined. The Republican candidates had a lot of staff turnover, and there's been, a lot of squabbling on the Republican ticket and so forth. So it's sort of all manner of things that matter to a major race. You'd rather be Abigail Spanberger right now than win some Earl Sears. But it's not even Labor Day as we're recording this. And so, the race will get going in the fall, and the Republicans are going to need something that is sort of a visceral reminder. Terry McAuliffe didn't lose in 2021 because he said, schools shouldn't listen to parents. That was just sort of the punctuation point on a sort of something that was out there brewing, like as you said, Loudon and so forth. And that's the risk, is some sort of unforced error like that. So, I would keep an eye on this thing in Fairfax. If anything else comes to light about schools concealing stuff from parents around these various issues, those are the kinds of things that can crystallize it. But as you said at the top, we're an off-year election. In 2021, Joe Biden was already, trading in the high 40s at best in terms of his approval rating in Virginia, and that was a real drag and a real wind in Glenn Youngkin's back. Winsome Earl Sears has the opposite situation now. Trump is trading in the high 30s, low 40s here, not popular. And, Virginia and Maryland are the two states that have been hit hardest by the layoffs. And so the sort of general atmosphere, favors Spanberger, and it's almost impossible to overstate how much it favors Spanberger right
Andy,
now.
we got 30 seconds left, but you reminded me of something I wanted to talk about. The Virginia, Barack Obama carried the state, and then, a year later, a Democrat won by, 17 points. It was a swing of, like 25-point swing. But if you look closely, it wasn't the same electorate. The turnout was much less in the second election. I guess my question is, the Democrat, Northern Virginia is already big for Democrats, but with these layoffs, with the Elon Musk stuff, with the Doge stuff, is there an animating thing that will help Democrats even more than the atmospherics you're talking about in terms of turnout and galvanize voters who might, pass on a mid-year election or off-year election and come out? In other words, do the fundamentals even help the Democrats even more?
They do, and that's why Sears is seizing on some of the stuff. She needs to energize the Republican base that voted for Trump. It doesn't always show up for these elections. And the other problem the Republicans have is there is no one on the ticket from Northern Virginia, and Northern Virginia is obviously a breadbasket of votes in this state, and so that's a problem for them as well. And so it's long odds. We haven't seen a ticket split in a long time. A lot of people think the Attorney General, who's sort of, kind of been a competent attorney general, sort of inoffensive figure, he's a Republican, could get reelected. But it's and the lieutenant governor, you should have him on. He's an the Republican lieutenant governor character or candidate, excuse me. He's an interesting character. But they haven't. They are facing an uphill. They are facing an uphill climb. And the Democrats are feeling pretty confident.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and for our next segment, we've invited Charlie Stone, a contributor at RCP, to share the latest interview that he conducted for the RCP video series, The Unknowns. Charlie's guest this time is author Alex Hutchinson, who has a new book out called The Explorer's Gene: Why We Seek Big Challenges, New Flavors, and the Blank Spots on the Map. Now here's Charlie in conversation with Alex Hutchinson.
First of all, Alex, thank you for joining us. And second, are book titles getting longer? It seems like we just keep adding more to the cover.
Charlie, thanks for having me. And, I can't count the number of hours that were spent brainstorming, like which keywords it's got to be searchable. It's got to pop out of the Amazon listings. So my goodness, we're asking book titles to do a lot for us these days.
We certainly are. But obviously some great stuff in here. And I love it because you sort of explore why people dive into the unknowns. And I don't know if you know it, but this show's called The Unknowns, where we kind of dive into the unknowns of people. So we're kind of sort of kismet in some ways that we're chatting. But give me a brief summary. What are you tackling in this book? What drove you to write it? What, itch are you trying to scratch?
I mean, the itch I'm trying to scratch is trying to figure out why I'm trying to scratch those itches. In a sense, is why do we always want something different? Why do we want something? Why aren't we just happy with what we've got? And that's, in a career sense or in a geographical sense or whatever. I'm really trying to understand where does that urge to veer off onto the off the beaten track come from, and what does it do for us? Is it good? Is it bad? How do we do it better?
Yeah, and crack open my brain if you want and take a peek, because I have that, right? I'm never, it's not boredom per se, but I'm always like, what about that? What about that? What about that? Is that what you're trying to answer? Are you like that, Alex? Are you like, what about that? What about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm asking, why do people start podcasts called The Unknowns? Like, why? Like, and I am like that to some extent in different aspects of my life. And I think I would argue if you ask people, some people will say like, oh, you're writing a book about exploring. Well, I'm not an explorer. And I get it. They're saying, I don't want to go to the South Pole, which is fine. But I think all of us in some aspect of our lives are pushing boundaries a little bit, finding out whether it's in the food you cook or in the music you listen to. We're all kind of curious about what's outside of our current experience in some respects.
Yeah, give me a sense of that. Obviously, you have interviewed and talked to people who have achieved unbelievable feats. Concurrently, you've also interviewed people who've just done stuff they didn't expect to do. Can you give me a sense of two stories where they're seemingly different, but the reasons are the same?
One of my favorite stories is there's a speed skater called Niels van der Poel who he was a very good junior speed skater, like a world junior champion, who then went to the Olympics in 2018 and came 14th. And decided, this sucks. I don't want to come 14th. He walked away from the sport, joined the Swedish Army for a year, did elite ranger training, came back, decided he wanted to go to the Olympics again, but decided he didn't want to just do what everyone else had done. He wanted to try a completely radically different training protocol. And so he basically invented a completely different way of training, which involved, first of all, he only trained 5 days a week, which is unheard of for an Olympic athlete because he wanted to go skydiving on the weekends. He didn't skate for like a year at a time. He was just doing biking and ski mountaineering and running. Anyway, I won't go like too far down the rabbit hole. Suffice to say, he trained like nobody had ever trained for speed skating. And he went to the Olympics and he won 2 gold medals and set 2 world records. And then sort of swiped his hands and said, yep, okay, that was good. And he walked away from the sport. So this is something that people have spent a lot of energy trying to figure out how to train for elite sports like speed skating. There's a consensus on how you do it, and he did it completely differently and had a great result.
Was there something in the approach? Did he care less in some regards? Like, I've been to the Olympics, but this time I'm going to focus on something else. How did you, in your analysis, what was it?
So the guiding principle for him was that he wanted to have fun. Speed skating had become a job for him, and he was going and doing these training sessions which were not engaging for him. And his epiphany was, to win the Olympics, I'm going to have to work really, really insanely hard, harder than anyone else in the world. And in order to get myself to work that hard, for him at least, he decided I need to be doing it in a way that I enjoy, that I wake up in the morning and I'm like, hell yeah, I want to go for a 9-hour run in the mountains rather than go skate around, a track 52,000 times. So for him, it came back to this idea that exploring is fun, that by following our instincts of what we actually want to do, that leads us in productive directions.
So it sounds trite, but as I get older, everything trite seems to be really true. But like, it's the journey, not the destination, right? Is it something about the journey that in small steps along the way that you're sating your sense of why you're doing this?
Yeah, look, I share your hesitation about wanting to say these words. It's like, as I was writing this book, I was like, man, how do I convince people? How do I say is the journey not the destination? How do I say it in a new way so that people will believe it? Because I've heard it so many times, but it's you just sort of dismiss it as just another cliche, but it really is. And so I think exploring can go wrong, right? Like lots of explorers end up dying in the jungle or whatever, or they discover something new and they're like, well, I want to discover something more. They end up dying. What distinguishes like really good productive exploration from exploration gone wrong? I think exploration goes wrong when you start to believe that it's the destination that matters, where you're like, I need to get to this, to the next ridge, or if I can just achieve this one thing, then I'll finally be happy. And that pushes you to do things in a way that it's an illusion. You never. So if you can be like Niels van der Poel and say, I'm going to train like an animal, but I'm going to do it in a way that is fun, then you've won no matter what. Even if he hadn't won the Olympics, I don't think he would have ended up regretting making that decision.
Obviously, not everyone's like him. I mean, we're all sort of doing our daily jobs. What advice would you give to someone who is in a good job, kind of bored? Is there something better out there, but he or she has a family they need to support? Like, what's the risk ratio that you recommend them pushing, or is there a way they can find satisfaction in what they're doing?
Yeah. So in the exploring literature, and there is a scientific literature that looks at these things, there's something called the explore-exploit dilemma. Like, do you venture into the unknown, or do you just take advantage of the situation you've got? And unfortunately, I will confess that there is not a universal answer, right? Like the right answer for someone, contemplating, I don't know if this career is right for me. Should I make a shift? And I say this as someone who made some big career shifts. I was a physicist until I was 28, and then I became a journalist. There is no like, here are the 3 factors that will determine whether you should or should not. It all depends on, like you said, there's contextual factors. Like, do you have kids? Are you, when's the rent due? But if I was giving a general piece of advice, it would go back to this Niels van der Poel point about being honest about what interests you and what you find, what you're super curious about. So if you look at like 8-month-old infants, you show them a sequence of toys or a sequence of shapes. If it's totally predictable, they get bored. You can tell because they look away. You track their gaze. If it's totally random, they get bored and they look away. But there's an intermediate level of uncertainty and predictability that interests them. There's a pattern, but they can't quite figure out what it is. They're going to keep watching. That's at 8 months old. We already have an instinct for this level of intermediate uncertainty that will teach us, has the potential to teach us the most about the world. So I would say, find a way of tuning into that inner voice of saying, well, what would I do if I was just doing what was really interesting to me? Because as adults, it's hard to find opportunities to listen to that voice.